As we all know, things like water and juice tend to freeze within a few hours after putting them in the freezer. But have you ever noticed that alcohol doesn't tend to freeze? And have you ever wondered why that is? The average temperature of a freezer is around 0 degrees Fahrenheit, which is equivalent to about negative 18 degrees Celsius. Turns out alcohol actually can freeze, just not at the temperature that most freezers are. In order for alcohol to freeze, the temperature of the freezer would have to be much, much colder. So even though alcohol won't freeze in our freezers, it can in fact freeze, and it's time to bust that myth. Let's talk about a little bit of the chemistry behind it and what ingredients make alcohol much harder to freeze. Ethanol is the key ingredient that makes alcohol alcohol, and it's also what makes freezing it much more difficult. The freezing point of pure ethanol is negative 173 degrees Fahrenheit, but of course, most alcoholic drinks aren't made of pure ethanol. Alcohol is often categorized by its ABV, or its alcohol by volume. In other words, the ABV is the proof of concentration of a drink and represents how many millimeters of pure ethanol are present in 100 milliliters of a liquid. So, the higher the ABV, the lower the freezing point. In other words, the higher proof alcohol it is, the colder it would have to be to freeze. Let's break it down a little bit into what drinks freeze the fastest and what drinks freeze the slowest. Beer, for example, has an ABV of around 2 to 12% with a freezing point of approximately 28 degrees Fahrenheit, meaning it would actually freeze in our typical domestic freezers. Ultimately, it freezes without hesitation. So again, just because it has ethanol in it doesn't mean it's impossible to freeze. And be careful because the water in the beer expands as it freezes and often causes the cans to explode. Wine has an ABV of around 12% and can freeze at about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. So also be careful because wine will likely at least start to freeze if you put it in the freezer. Vodka, on the other hand, typically has an ABV of around 40%. So it would take a freezer that goes as low as negative 16.5 degrees Fahrenheit to actually freeze it. Even Everclear, with an ABV of 95%, can freeze if it gets cold enough. So let's talk a little bit about the big picture. We have to remember that almost all liquids can freeze, or at least most of them typically have a freezing and a boiling point. Liquids have a characteristic temperature at which they turn into solids, known as their freezing point. In theory, the melting point of a solid should be the same as the freezing point of the liquid. When the solution cools to room temperature, it should solidify, but it often doesn't. A couple of interesting facts on the subject is that when you put alcohol in the freezer, though it may not freeze, some of its properties may actually change. Top liquor brands actually don't recommend that you put your alcohol in the freezer, because the colder it gets, the more flavor and smell is lost. Also, as the temperature of the liquid drops, the thickness of it tends to increase. On another note, but equally as interesting, the brand Absolut had an outbreak of complaints from people claiming that their alcohol was watered down because it froze in their freezers, and this was their response. As any smart business would, Absolut shifted the blame to people likely having really cold freezers, rather than their alcohol being lower in ABV than they claimed it to be. Ultimately, alcoholic beverages have a freezing point between the freezing point of water, which is 0 degrees Celsius and 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and that of pure ethanol, which is negative 114 degrees Celsius and negative 173 degrees Fahrenheit. Most alcoholic beverages contain more water than alcohol, so some will freeze in a home freezer, like beer and wine. Feel free to experiment with alcohol and their freezing points to test the accuracy of all these claims.